Welcome to the Zoom Wednesday night Bible study, and thank you for taking the time to watch this video, and I hope that it will be a blessing to you. I especially welcome those who might be visiting the Spirit of the Cross's YouTube channel or website because we met at the church's information booth at a recent Pride event on the campus of Alabama A&M or Rocket City Pride at Butler Green Park or UA Huntsville. Since it's Gay Pride season in the Huntsville area, tonight's lesson will be on a clobber passage. The term clobber passage has been around a long time in our community. It refers to the 6 passages in the Bible that have been misused to clobber LGBTQIA people and their allies. So tonight, let's unclobber the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah, and along with Romans 1, are probably the most used of all clobber passages. Sodom and Gomorrah has been misused as an example of God's judgment and punishment against homosexuality, whether it be an individual or a nation. But a careful and close look at the passage and its context will show that the sin of Sodom was inhospitality, not homosexuality. A text taken out of context is nothing but pretext. When a text is taken out of context, all that you're left with is a con. Both of these are adages that emphasize the importance of understanding the context of a biblical passage. So we'll first look at the context of the Sodom story from Genesis chapter 19. 3 important points help us to understand the context of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. The first is antithesis or parallel teachings of the Bible. The second is the desert code of hospitality. And the third is the timing of the decision to destroy Sodom. I'm going to share my screen now, and we'll get started. The Bible contains many different literary devices to convey the message that it wants to convey. Parables, hyperbole, metaphor, paradox, poetry, and on are examples of different literary devices in the Bible, and they're found in both the Old and New Testaments. The literary device that's relevant to our study tonight is antithesis, which is a parallel structure contrasting 2 passages. For example, the Psalms, the book of Proverbs, the book of James in the New Testament, and the Sermon on the Mount are loaded with antithesis or parallel teachings. For instance, it will say the wise person does this while a foolish person does that. A godly person will do this and an ungodly person will do something else. In Jesus's Sermon on the Mount, as he concludes it, he says a wise person is the person who hears the words of mine and puts them into practice, and their life is like a house that is built upon the rock. But the foolish person is the person who hears my words and does not put them into practice, and their life is like a house built upon the sand. So all of these are antithesis teachings, parallel teachings. Well, in Genesis chapter 19, which is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, Genesis 19 is a part of a larger antithesis teaching section that contrasts good and bad hospitality. Genesis 18 shows what good hospitality is. Genesis 19 shows what bad hospitality is. And we don't have time to do it in this brief Bible study, but I encourage you to read the first few verses of Genesis 18 and then read the first few verses of Genesis 19, and you will see the setup is identical. And it's identical because the point of these two passages is, one, to teach good hospitality that Abraham and Sarah extended to the strangers that came to them, versus the bad hospitality that the men of Sodom extended or threatened to the visitors to Lot's house. So read those two and you'll see what I'm talking about. But the story of Sodom is in the context of a parallel teaching, good and bad hospitality. The second thing, the second point that's important in the context is the desert code of hospitality. Whether it is in the Old Testament or New, it has always mattered how the people of God treat the stranger and immigrant. Scholarship has recognized this and has termed it the desert code of hospitality. And next, I'm going to read from the Academic Standard of Bible Dictionaries, the HarperCollins Bible Dictionary, and their article on hospitality. Hospitality is the act of friendship shown to a visitor. Hospitality in the ancient Near East was tightly bound by the customs and practices which all were expected to observe. One ignored the customs at one's own peril. To try to understand those carefully structured and rigidly observed practices in terms of relative informality of modern Western practices of hospitality would be to completely misunderstand them. Since transient strangers lacked customary or legal standing within the visited community, it was imperative that they be under the protection of a patron, a host who was an established community member. Through a personal bond with the host, something inns could not offer, strangers were incorporated as guests or clients or proteges. To offend the stranger, become guest, was to offend the host, who was protector and patron of the guest. And look at what they say next, that the best case of this, the prime example of this, is underscored in the story of Sodom and what happened at Lot's home in Genesis 19. Then the third point that's important to understand about the context is that the decision to destroy Sodom was made before anything happened in Genesis 19. If you read the last half of Genesis 18, Abraham has gotten word that God is going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. Well, Lot is Abraham's nephew. And so Abraham confronts or challenges or negotiates with God to not destroy Sodom. And it's a fascinating give and take between Abraham and God. Abraham says, surely, God, you will not destroy Sodom if you could find 50 people in it that are righteous. This idea of you destroying the whole city, but yet you're a better God than that. That doesn't sound like the God I know. And they go back and forth, and finally Abraham gets God down to 10 people. So according to the biblical story, Sodom was destroyed because God could not find 10 righteous people in it. It does not say that Sodom was destroyed because of homosexuality. That's important. Now, so far, I've given 3 points of context considerations. Now, one can choose to read Genesis 19 out of context and maybe twist the passage into some type of condemnation of homosexuality. But if they do that, because they have taken the text out of context, all that they're left with is only pretext and a con. Now, let's look at the actual story from Genesis 19, beginning at verse 1. The two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. He said, "Please, my lords, turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet, and then you can rise early and go on your way." I'll stop right there. When you read that and compare it to the beginning of Genesis 18, you see the setup that this is, both stories are about hospitality. They said, "No, we will spend the night in the square." But he urged them strongly. So they turned aside to him and entered his house, and he made a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house. I'm going to stop right there. This is part of the story that I like to refer to things that gay people see that others don't. Now, if the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is supposed to be about sexual orientation, which is not, but that's what people say, if it's about sexual orientation, if that's your argument, then you've got a big problem. You've got 100% of the male population as gay. Because you see it on your screen that all the men, from the youngest to the oldest, all of the men, 100% of the population was at the house of Lot. Now, that is absurd to try to make that argument that 100% of the male population of any city would be gay. Even the most gay-friendly cities in the U.S. or around the world still have just a small percentage of their male population that's gay. You know, and so if you're trying to make this Sodom and Gomorrah into a story about gay folks, you've got a huge problem. It's an absurd problem or argument to try to make that 100% of the male population was gay. Come on now, come on. And all these men, they called out to Lot, picking back up at verse 5, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we may know them." Sexual violence towards immigrants and strangers has been around a long, long time. And again, it happens here in Genesis 19. Lot went out of the door to the men, shut the door after him, and said, "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Look, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you and do to them as you please." That makes my skin crawl. Wow. And then Lot says, "Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." Lot is referring to the desert code of hospitality there. But they replied, "Stand back." And they said, "This fellow came here as an alien, and he would play the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them." Then they pressed hard against the man Lot and came near the door to break it down. But the men inside reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck with blindness the men who were at the door of the house, both small and great, so that they were unable to find the door. Here's what's happened. The incident outside of Lot's home was inhospitality in the form of a threatened rape. Please hear me clearly. Rape is an act of violence. It is sinful. It is wrong, no matter the gender or sexual orientation. I want to share with you the commentary from the Common English Bible, their study Bible, as they comment on verses 4 and 5 of Genesis 19. Here, the type of sex is violent sex, rape that demeans and humiliates its male victims. The townsmen see this abuse as a way to harm and eliminate outsiders. The story, and they refer to Judges, also Judges 19:22 and 20 verse 5, and I'll get back to that in just a second. The story, therefore, specifically criticizes rape, whether it is against men, Lot's visitors, or against women, Lot's daughters. Such behavior is utterly opposed to the sacred duty to be hospitable. The story's earliest interpreters focus on the townsman's harsh treatment of outsiders rather than on the sexual activity by which they meant to cause harm. Folks, the story of Sodom is about rape. Now, let me go back and talk about Genesis 19 for a second. A lot of people don't know about Genesis 19, of Judges 19, rather. Judges 19 tells the story of a Levite and his concubine who was welcomed into a man's home in Gibeah. And just like the story of Sodom, all the men of the city demand to know who this visitor is, like who this stranger is. And yet again, there's a violent threat to this stranger, to this outsider. And because of the desert code of hospitality, the host says to the men of the city almost the identical words that Lot said in Genesis 19. But this time in Judges 19, there are no angels. And to satisfy the men, the concubine is offered to the men. And unlike Sodom and Gomorrah, there is an actual rape in Judges 19. The concubine is abused so badly that she dies. So Judges 19, same story, but there's a rape and a murder. Judges 19, I'm going to say it again, is a repeat of the Sodom story, except that there is actually a rape that occurs, not just a threat of one, and it is a woman sent out to the men. Here's my point. No one points to the rape in Judges 19 and tries to use the story as a universal condemnation of heterosexuality. That would be absurd. Then I ask this question, why is it then okay to use Genesis 19 as a universal condemnation of gay people when it is clear that we are dealing with rape, an act of sexual violence? Listen, I am gay. Do not confuse me with a rapist. And if you are LGBTQIA, don't let anyone confuse you as a rapist either. And if you're straight and a LGBTQIA ally, do not let them confuse your LGBTQIA friend or loved one as a rapist. And then finally, let the Bible interpret the Bible. Sodom is referenced 9 other times in the Bible. Now, you can run a search for them with an online concordance, but none of the other references to Sodom in the Bible reference anything to deal with homosexuality. There are references to arrogance, there are references to not taking care of the poor, and there are references to sexual immorality in general. Again, not specifically homosexuality. And the most interesting reference to Sodom comes from Jesus himself. The only time that Jesus mentions Sodom is when he instructs his disciples on how to respond to, wait for it, to inhospitality on their missionary journey. Jesus tells them in Matthew 10, if anyone refuses to welcome you or listen to your words, shake the dust off your feet as you leave that house or city. I assure you that it will be more bearable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah on Judgment Day than it will be for that city. Let that sink in. The only time Jesus mentions Sodom and Gomorrah is in the context of inhospitality. Folks, I hope it's been clear. The Bible cannot mean now what it didn't mean then. If the story of Sodom and Gomorrah was about inhospitality then, which it was, it cannot mean homosexuality now. It just can't. Now, the teachable moment in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is that God expects and even demands that all are welcome, that strangers are to be treated as friends, and we are to look out for one another. And I find it ironic, I find it interesting that a story in the Bible that is there to show the sinfulness of inhospitality and refusing a welcome to strangers is used somehow, has been twisted and used somehow as justification to mistreat and exclude the LGBTQIA community. Amazing to me. So let's learn from the story of Sodom and reflect on ways to show welcome and hospitality and inclusion of people who might be different from us, regardless of their sexual orientation or gender expression. Now, this lesson has been brief, much shorter than when I teach it in person. So if you need to rewind this video and pause it on some of those outlines and look at those scriptures and do your own research, I encourage you to do so, and know that you can always contact me if you have any questions. It's been brief, but I hope it's been enough to unclobber the clobber passage of Genesis 19, 1 through 11, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Until next week, God's grace and peace to you.